Good evening. Welcome to this evening's edition of Tiski Sound. My name is Aaron Bastani. Thanks for joining us today. It's been a really weird couple of years. Actually, it's probably been quite a weird decade. A lot of things have happened which aren't meant to happen. We've had 300-year low interest rates for 10 years. We've had stagnant productivity, wages, GDP per capita. But I don't think anybody expected negative prices for oil. That's precisely what happened yesterday. That's the primary topic for today's show. We're joined by James Meadway. James, come in. How you doing?
I'm not too bad, thank you.
How good. I'm good. We had a great interview actually with your former boss, John McDonnell.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah, he was on good form.
He was on good form. Yeah. So James is a former economic advisor to John McDonnell, previously at the New Economics Foundation. You were I always say chief economist. You're the senior economist.
I was chief economist.
I don't get okay. Chief economist.
Everything, you know. So
yeah. So you speak with some authority on these things, and more recently, what have you moved into post McDonnell, post Labour?
All sorts. I've been writing a book and writing lots of things actually. So that's one of the things I've been doing. And obviously the pandemic is keeping us all quite occupied one way or the other. So writing a fair bit about that.
Regular contributor to our media, it must be said. We also have Michael Walker. Just pull you in, Michael. I know Michael.
Hiya, Aaron.
Bit of a break this evening. Michael is going to join us really for the second half of the show.
I'm gonna lurk for the first half and just absorb Meadway's wisdom.
Imbibe it.
Okay.
That's fine. Yeah. When you come back in, we'll be talking more about actually the reality of UK mortality stats today. The ONS, the Office for National Statistics, released mortality figures for the last month. They would suggest that so far coronavirus deaths have been significantly understated. There's also data around deaths in care homes. So far, deaths have been those recorded in hospitals. So we'll talk about that shortly. But like I said, we'll bring you back in probably about 5:30, Michael. So enjoy your little rest, your lurk. James, let's talk about Petro-Geddon. Before we go any further, I just want to introduce the topic to our viewers. I'm sure you've probably seen sardonic or comical tweets or Facebook posts, or you probably think, how the hell does that work? I just want to introduce you to what went into negative prices yesterday. So historically, there are two trading classifications for what's called sweet light crude oil. These serve as benchmark prices for oil worldwide. One is Brent crude. The other is West Texas Intermediate, WTI. And that was the thing that went negative yesterday. These are called light because they're relatively low density, and sweet because of their low sulfur content. I always found that quite odd. Brent crude is extracted from the North Sea and comprises Brent blend, Forties blend, Oseberg, and Ekofisk crudes. And the Brent oil marker is known as the Brent blend, London Brent, or Brent Petroleum. I think of The Office when I say Brent. There you go. Brent is the leading global price benchmark for Atlantic Basin crude oils. So think about oil in the North Sea, etc. It is used to set the price for 2/3 of the world's internationally traded crude oil supply. So Brent oil, when you hear that, it refers to a particular sub-branch of oil production, but it's really important in terms of determining the global price. Besides Brent crude, which has also seen its price fall, as we'll see, there's WTI, and this is the thing that went negative yesterday, and it refers primarily to US oil. Alongside those, you have the OPEC oil-producing countries reference basket. You have Urals oil, and you also have the one in Nigeria, which is called, has a funny name, Bonny Light, which I found quite interesting. But as I've said, Brent crude is the primary benchmark. So if we can just get up this piece from The Guardian, graphic 1, Fox, that'd be great. Oil prices dip below zero as producers forced to pay to dispose of excess. Obviously, that makes very little sense. We'll make more sense of it in a second as we speak to James. If we can now go to graphic 2, this is Brent crude. This is not WTI. And you can see here, this is the market data in terms of the performance of Brent crude over a 3-month period. At the start of the year, it was above $60 a barrel. It's presently, I think it is, as you can see here, it's $19 a barrel here. I think it's probably gone up again. Basically, it's at a 18-year low. That's Brent. And as I've said, that's the one that determines global prices. And if we can just quickly move on now to graphic 3, this is Texas Intermediate. And you can see here, it starts around a similar price, or just under $60 at the beginning of the year. and it's fallen precipitously. Obviously, the culmination of that, the peak of that was yesterday as it fell into negative prices. Hence, you can see where there's no actual line there. But the long-term trend is quite clear anyway. It's going to $20 a barrel. And yesterday was a bit of an anomaly, but it might come back. So, James, these are clearly longer-term things, longer-term figures in regards to the price of oil. Why is it bad that oil is so cheap? Surely that's a good thing. That was meant to be one of the hinges of US, UK foreign policy for so long, was ensuring cheap oil supply. Why all of a sudden is that such a bad thing?
It's in this case, it's an indicator of a collapse in demand for oil, because what's happened since the outbreak of COVID-19 and the series of lockdowns and the rapid decline in economic activity that's taken place is that there's far less demand for oil. There's fewer people traveling, is the most obvious one. So the planes aren't flying, the cars aren't being driven, there's much less oil being consumed. Beyond that, there's lower movement of goods and other services and this sort of thing. So oil demand has collapsed. That is putting pressure on oil producers, because oil, the economics are actually sort of fairly simple, really. But once you set up a well, once you start refining, you have to kind of keep pumping the thing. So the critical bit is that you want storage, because you don't necessarily want to try and sell all this oil all at once. You can't necessarily sell it all at once because there's only so much demand for it. And what's happened is that the storage, particularly for West Texas Intermediate, has been almost completely used up, or at least it's all otherwise occupied. And because the storage isn't there, what we found yesterday was that people with contracts to actually supply the oil or buy the oil in the future were desperate to get rid of it, and were therefore going to pay people to try and take it off their hands. That's what a negative price means. So in other words, it's a sign of how badly disrupted the world economy has become as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. That's why it's a bad sign.
And can you explain why would something go from $10, $15, $20 to minus prices and recover so quickly?
Well, the minus price is only on a very specific contract for some delivery of oil in May, right? So it's only a certain kind of oil to be delivered at a certain point in the future. That's a negative price. Right. Prices of other oil that's sort of being sloshing around all over the world. Some of it's in storage tanks. Some of it will be in super tankers. Increasingly, super tanker being used as temporary storage. Some of it is held at refineries. That still has a positive price, but it has slumped, and it's slumped because of a lack of demand throughout the world. And there's a lack of demand basically because economies are, in conventional terms, collapsing. If you're talking in Britain, forecasts usually around a 35% decline in GDP. In other words, the economy shrinks by a third as we usually measure it in the next 3 months. That's the expectation. So there's far less demand for oil. There's an oversupply of oil, and as a result, the price crashes. This is basic demand and supply economics at that point. It becomes peculiar because of this storage issue. This is expensive to store oil, which is why there's never really enough storage capacity in the oil industry. People don't want to have to pay for this, so they always run it a bit tight. And when you have a situation like this where the demand has disappeared, you've got loads of oil, and you're desperate to get rid of the stuff, that's when the negative price appears.
So we had a recent deal amongst the OPEC countries. Primarily, there's been also deals, I think, effectively bilateral deals between the Saudis and the Russians to produce less oil, which is obviously historically what they do, so that prices go back up. Now, this deal was lauded, particularly by Donald Trump, less than a week ago, as a solution to getting prices back up again. Why hasn't this worked? Why are prices continuing to fall or just standing still?
Because you're running to catch up with an economy that's in free fall. Right, if you're British economy is shrinking by 35%. The projections on the US economy will shrink by 50%. The German economy is shrinking by 35-40%. This is happening right the way across the developed world at this point in time. There is no cut in production and oil that you can plausibly make that will get you to the point of being able to keep up with that, because the oil's everywhere. Like we have an incredibly sort of carbon heavy and oil heavy economy. It is used all the time in transport, and it's used all the time in anything that needs transporting, and it's used a fair bit as a sort of intermediate product in fertilizer and plastics and a few other things like this. So it's absolutely central to what the economy does. And if demand is collapsing in the way that it is, there is no cut in oil production you can plausibly make that's enough to overcome that. And obviously there's a huge amount of, sort of politics involved here. There's a dispute in OPEC about OPEC is the cartel of some of the major oil producers, not the US, not Britain, not Russia, that sort of thing. A dispute in OPEC about how to respond to changes in the oil economy in particular, running through last year into this. So that's a political element of it. There's a few years ago, you might remember, Saudi Arabia led the charge in this, persuaded OPEC to not cut production, to keep production very high and crash oil prices quite deliberately back in 2014 with the intention of trying to wipe out the US shale oil industry. The other big factor in recent years has been the appearance of US shale oil, which has turned America basically from being a huge importer of oil into having self-sufficiency and being an exporter of oil potentially. So that's a really critical change in the whole oil economy just in the last 5 to 8 years or so. And that's induced this new sort of wild card in this. Trump himself fixates on the oil industry, coal as well. He has a real sort of notion that this is incredibly important for America's future prosperity. It isn't, but this is what he thinks. And that's why he's promising these interventions. There's talk of the US government, paying to take oil off people's hands. They have huge strategic storage that they're now trying to make available to this glut of oil that now exists. There's a real panic about the state of the industry.
So a few questions. If the price stays where it is, if it stays below $20 for Brent crude, and that's the really meaningful one, as I hope I've already made clear. If it stays below $20, does that mean that most major multinationals go out of business? I mean, obviously, if you're BP, if you're Royal Dutch Shell, if it stays there for 6 months, 12 months, what happens?
Well, the economics of oil is basically that you have very, very high fixed costs. There are things you just have to pay for, and then there's not much room for you to maneuver on the variable costs. So once you have a well, you keep drilling, you keep pumping, you keep refining, and you just keep doing that until the thing runs out, right? That's basically what you have to do. And depending on where you are in the world, there's a cost to doing that, which will vary. So if you're in the North Sea, if you're Norway or Britain, the cost is really, really high. You get very high quality oil out of this. Brent crude is light and sweet. It's very good, easy to refine oil, but it's very expensive to get that. If you're Saudi Arabia, your cost of getting oil out of the ground at least a few years ago is something like $10 a barrel when it's like 50 or 60 in other parts of the world. So you can still do this potentially profitably. Other fields and other producers get really hammered when the price goes low. So if the price stays low for a long period of time, it hammers the expensive producers and producers with expensive fields and reserves that are harder to get to. So that does mean the big private producers like BP, for example, like Shell, like certainly people with interest in the North Sea, start to get squeezed by this. Now, in the case of the North Sea, it's a very mature field. The stuff is running out quite rapidly, more rapidly than people thought it would. More so for gas, but certainly for oil as well, over the last few years. So they get hammered. And the challenge then gets into the second one of what does that do in terms of the financing of some of these producers? And that, I think, is a particular issue for shale oil producers in the US, which are often smaller and are very, very heavily indebted. It's been a rapidly growing industry. Companies have borrowed huge amounts to invest. It looks like this great expansion of production. Now, with the collapse in prices, they have debts they have to pay and they can't pay it. So there's this real risk of a major wave of bankruptcies across US shale oil producers in particular.
And talks about multinational companies or, specific ones. It sounds like there's a lot more exposure to these problems for those active in the North Sea. What about nation states? I mean, it's obviously a huge problem for the likes of Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia. If oil prices stay, let's say worst case scenario, Brent crude, it was $15 a barrel for 6 months. What kind of problems could that store up for the global south, given that it would be happening at the exact same time as a downturn in global economic activity, having to deal with a pandemic and so on?
I mean, this feels more like a sort of classic, crisis of development, that if you have countries, particularly less developed countries, that are dependent on one particular commodity export. Classic example is the third world debt crisis, when you have mixed in with that a collapse in the price of cocoa and chocolate and this sort of thing in the late 70s into the early 80s. If you're really dependent on a single export in particular, and that crashes in price, you are absolutely done for. If you have a government that needs to get taxes out of selling this stuff, you can't pay for your government services. You don't have the wherewithal to do that. You don't have the capacity, as you might have in this country for a period of time, to simply print money and get on with it. The US certainly has this capacity. If you're Angola or something, the capacity to do that is much, much more limited. So you have this very bad combination of a collapse in the price of something you rely on to fund what you're doing, and at the same time, as we've seen since the crash, a very big increase in debt in the global south, broadly defined, led by China, who is something of an exceptional category there, but a very large number of sub-Saharan African countries also have very big increases in debt. Those ones that are dependent on oil exports, of which there are a few, oil and potentially gas exports, then are facing quite a serious crunch at the same time as a health crisis is turning up. So suddenly this looks very, very deeply entangled. So it's a symptom of this collapse in demand worldwide, but it can turn into a particular crisis where countries or institutions like big multinationals are dependent on it. And it can blow back further. Oil for a very long period of time was seen as a very, very safe bet. Right. Now, there has been a move. I mean, the Bank of England here has led the charge, I would say, internationally in trying to get the financial system in Britain out of investments in fossil fuels, in oil, in coal, in things that are very carbon intensive, recognizing you're not going to be able to do this in the future. But the financial industry as a whole is deeply entangled with all of this because it's always looked like a safe bet. People always need oil. It's an essential commodity. So you invest in it because it's a really safe return. If this turns into a collapse for a long period of time, and it leads to serious financial difficulties, which it will do for major producers, that will also turn into serious difficulties for some of their investors, which will be the investors looking for safe returns, so insurance companies, pension funds, things of this ilk in particular. So this is where the blowback starts to happen.
And so if oil becomes so cheap, if fossil fuels become so cheap, and of course we know that the price of them is volatile, but generally speaking, it's a scarce resource. It's not, unlimited. So in the long term, it'll go up in price because there's only so much of it. Obviously in the absence of competitive energy sources coming from solar, wind, which is happening. But in isolation, that's what should happen to it in the longer term. Given in the short term, however, it's going to become incredibly cheap.
Yeah.
What does that mean for the renewables sector? Because all of a sudden, people were saying, oh, well, by 2022, including myself, by 2022, 2023, electric cars will be cheaper than petrol cars. And yet we've seen this sustained downturn now in oil prices for a couple of years. Does that mean that the kind of fossil fuel economy could last a bit longer than it should have done? Or is there a bigger story going on here?
The biggest story here is why has the price collapsed? It has not collapsed because of changes in the production of oil. It's not like there's some wild new technology, which means you can make oil very, very cheaply. It's collapsed because demand for oil has collapsed globally, and it's collapsed globally because of the coronavirus crisis. So it's this huge demand shock for the industry as a whole, which is leading to the collapse in prices here. That tells you that exactly as you say, over the longer term, this is not really going to be sustainable. There is a sort of production price of oil internationally. It will vary depending on how difficult it is to get hold of this stuff, but basically that's what's going to end up setting a long-term price for it. That means that the crisis is going to appear in the oil industry, and you'll find oil companies running off to governments begging for handouts and bailouts and things of this ilk. Right? That is already happening for sure in America. We know this because they've been very noisy about it, and Trump has already said he's going to support them. But that means that if you see this crisis as something that's going to affect the oil industry, it is a political crisis more than it is simply an economic crisis. It's a crisis of what the government does. And the government at that point, any government has the option of saying, okay, we'll just give you money till you get back on your feet and demand recovers and everything's back to normal. Or you can say, we're going to do a Green New Deal. We will pay the transitional costs that people who work in this industry, will pay for them to maintain their standard of living, at least to some extent, to retrain them. We'll invest elsewhere. We'll take what we can of this industry and turn it around. Right? That would be the other response to this. So you could see this as a big opportunity for renewables. The fact that this is a political crisis, because that's what it is now, means that there's an opportunity to take a different political direction on it. It's not simply determined by the market at this point. So there's potential here, and I think the argument has presented quite strongly that if there is a crisis in the oil industry, we are not going to get back to how it was before. We have to go and do something different from this point onwards.
I've just been told by producer Fox, we've got 1,500 people watching. Very kind of you to join us. If you can share the show, we've got the original tweet for the show on the Novara Media Twitter account in the description. Always much appreciated. Get your questions in on the hashtag Tisky Sour. Also in the comments with the rocket emoji. Fox has told me less than 1,500. Well, I'm not running YouTube today because I want good bandwidth. So my apologies. I'll get it up shortly and I'll get the correct number. I'm going to ask you one more question about this, actually. Do you think that there could be a realization by a lot of people that if you have Donald Trump subsidizing the US aviation industry, subsidizing the US oil industry, do you think people will go like, well, why would you do that but not support the Green New Deal? Do you think there could be a moment for popular realization that actually we could fund these things? It's just our political leaders choose not to.
That's exactly it. And I think it's the politicization of the crisis, which is immediate with this one. And there's a sort of underlying issue with COVID-19. The way it operates is it strikes probably the most important single institution in capitalism, which is the labor market and the relationship between labor and capital. because basically it says to a great number of people, you can't really do work anymore. Like, you have to go and do something else. You can't be associated with other people. This is worse than the crisis. So it really fundamentally disrupts that. And it politicizes it because it's government that orders this. And everything else starts to look a bit political as well. So suddenly the economy goes from being something that you can do nothing about because this is just how it works, to something that very visibly and obviously you can intervene. So I think exactly it opens up that option of doing something different. That you could just try and wind the clock back to how we were in, like, December 2019, or you can wind the clock forward and say we could do something different and better out of this. I think that's critical. I think these arguments, just to make this point, I think these arguments are going to become more pressing because the other bit that the collapse in oil prices suggests is the risk of a deflationary crisis. There is a risk of not only oil prices falling, but as demand falls away, prices of everything starts to fall, which sounds like it might be all right. But the real risk there is that the burden of debt everybody's built up, including now governments, the real burden starts to look heavier and heavier. Because basically, if money is becoming more and more expensive, which is what falling prices means, it becomes harder and harder to pay your debts in money. So there is this kind of severe danger somewhere down the line that the amount of debt that's in the economy looks a lot worse in real terms if prices start to fall. And if the oil price slump starts to turn into a more general price slump, then that's a proper sort of Great Depression situation you find yourself getting into.
I hadn't thought of that. I mean, the price in so many commodities, obviously, a significant part of that is obviously the energy inputs.
Exactly.
You talked at the beginning about the next quarter seeing a 35, or actually this quarter now, Q2, UK economic downturn of about 35%. If we can actually just pull up this graphic, Fox. I think it's graphic 5 from the FT. UK brace for long recession due to virus fear factor. Officials worried about public caution over spending and return to work after lockdown. James, I'm going to move on with Michael. We'll probably talk about this at the end of the show. But I just want to know what you think about this, because obviously we've had this furlough scheme introduced. Last week, Rishi Sunak said it was going to be, prolonged for an extra month. It was initially meant to cost 42 billion. It's now probably going to cost about 50 billion, probably more, because actually quite a few people are using it. I think yesterday in one day, people on the government payroll basically increased by a fifth, which is kind of nuts. And I think about an extra 7-8 times more people are expected to use it before it's done. So do you think that the Conservative Party, the government, are looking at the scale of the economic downturn? They're looking at the costs of this, the public, the taxpayer, in terms of effectively a bailout for much of the private economy over the next 3 to 4 months. And do you think they realise that ultimately this isn't really sustainable if we want to take this through to September to October? Do you think Rishi Sunak ultimately is going to have to argue for ending the lockdown by, say, June, July, purely from, in his mind, obviously, the basis of economic necessity?
Well, this is sustainable. Like, if you look at the interest rates that the government pays on the debt at this point in time, they are close to, as you mentioned in your introduction, they're close to the lowest they have been in human history. So it is very cheap, in fact, to just borrow the money and keep on paying for this. Projections from the Resolution Foundation showing that even if debt rose a lot, even if interest rates went back up to like their historic long-term average, like 2%, 2 and a bit percent, it would still be very low interest payments, debt repayments, because actually this is still a very low rate of interest. Think about what governments have had to pay in the past. So it's kind of sustainable from that point of view. And the critical thing here is that it has to be sustainable, because the costs of failing to get on top of this health crisis, the economic costs are absolutely astronomical. The 250,000 people dying completely wipes out your economy and destroys your health service. The costs of this, in anybody's terms, are astronomical and long-term, and you'll probably never recover from it. So you can't do that. Just in pure economic terms, you have to do something like this, which is kind of why they are doing something like this. The argument becomes a competitive one, which is the longer we're in lockdown, if somebody else is coming out of lockdown first, they're returning to ordinary economic growth, they can occupy the space, they can take markets, they can do this. And that's already happening. If you look at the projections from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, their modelling, you can take or leave it really, but they suggest that the British economy over the next 2 years will shrink about 6-7%. America, about the same. Italy, a bit less actually, I think they project it as. China, 1%. So who's going to come out on top in 2 years' time, right? It's fairly clear, just on that very crude measure, who's going to grow the fastest, who's going to recover the fastest. So if you're thinking in kind of competitive terms, you have to try and get out of lockdown as fast as possible, because somebody else will and you'll lose out, and you don't want to lose out. So that's the competitive logic driving this attempt to get out as soon as possible. It's not really driven by whether you can afford it. You can certainly afford it. It's driven by this broader sense of what it is to be a competitive economy. So I think we have to resist this very, very strongly. But the Financial Times raises something important. Having put in place measures saying, we are protecting you, you must stay here, there's no guarantee people will want to come out of that or trust the government to tell them to come out.
Yeah.
That could be quite an important reassertion of the power of labour, of people who work, in a way that we haven't seen for a long period of time.
Yeah,
There's a mass refusal to come out of this is suddenly you saying, I'm not going to do what you tell me. This is me taking control of the situation, us taking control of the situation, and we're going to impose this on you. So that could become quite a crunch point in a few months' time.
Let's bring up the next graphic. This is from Bloomberg, graphic 6A, Fox. This is from our best friend George Osborne, architect of UK austerity, says new cuts needed post-crisis. Great. And then if we can just pull up the quote from Mr. Osborne. When this is over, there's going to be a very large amount of debt, and it's not going to be bonanza time, he said during a CBI webinar event on Monday. We'll be going back into a period of retrenchment, which is to say austerity, and trying to bring down public sector debt, or bring public sector debt down. That is something we can focus on later. So I suppose at the very least, it's saying it's not something we need to focus on right now. James, how stupid is that? The idea that the focus should be austerity once we, quote, go back to normal in a year or two.
It's very stupid on a number of levels. It's stupid because we've had the experience of the last 10 years. By the way, George Osborne, if memory serves, never brought debt down. It rose as a share of GDP, as a burden every single year that he was Chancellor, if memory serves, from 2010 to 2016 when he resigned. It never actually came down. It was never brought under control when he was there. So on his own terms, he failed. And now he's going to lecture people about what they should do. In pure human terms, it's nonsense. Like, it's possible he hasn't got in his head the scale of the increase in debt that is going to take place, is already taking place. You know, this was George Osborne who's saying we must avoid 90% of debt to GDP. We're going to hit 100%, probably upwards of that, frankly, on at least some of the projections. So it's a huge scale of debt. And that means the amount of austerity you need to impose to try and plausibly say you reduce it will be astronomical. But we are living right now in the biggest possible demonstration of the value of the public sector and why you don't do cuts. So politically, it just becomes a complete non-starter. And I think there's going to be a split in the Tory party. In fact, there kind of already is around how you deal with some of this. Like, Boris Johnson's inclination is to basically try and make everyone like him and not do austerity. We know this, and he's got a sense of politically that's not going to work. Someone like Rishi Sunak and some of the other people out there have the idea that we need to get back on the sound finance track as soon as possible, out of lockdown, spend down the debt, make everyone pay for it, all that sort of George Osborne stuff. They will argue like that. I think what we'll get to is a sort of divide and rule more obviously than we had from 2010. 2010, it was we're all in this together. It's not really true. It's what they did. I think this time around, they might more obviously go for divide and rule. And you can see some of the think tanks lining up to say, oh, well, the old should pay for this crisis. The young have suffered so much, you know, ignoring the rather blunt fact that old people are far more likely to die as a result of this crisis. So it's hardly fair to say they haven't paid the consequences of it. It's nonsense. But I think they might go for that kind of divide and rule, maybe frame it as an intergenerational thing or find some other way around it. Probably very vicious stuff around migrants would be the obvious one to go for, and racism in general, making it more obvious than they did in 2010 rather than we're all in this together. It's like they're responsible, they pay for it if they go for it at all. But I suspect we're going to see a much bigger state in every part of the economy from here on in.
I want to bring you back in, Michael Walker. You still there?
I'm still there, yeah. I'm still here. I did nip for a very quick cup of tea, but
that's good. Do you want to ask?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear. We're going to move on to the next story, but do you have any questions to James in regards to the oil crisis, Petro-Geddon?
No, Petro-Geddon I haven't been following as closely as I should have been because I'm sort of reading about viruses for my interview tomorrow with a Harvard epidemiologist. But I suppose I do have a question about, you know, George Osborne saying we're going to need austerity after this, which is, you know, to what extent have the ruling class learned their lesson? You know, how hegemonic is George Osborne's sort of pro-austerity drive at this point in time? Do you see that as going to be sort of like a really powerful counterattack, or just plain old attack actually on Labour after this crisis, or do you think he's going to be somewhat isolated this time around?
I think, like I was saying, I think there's going to be a divide over this. I don't think it's particularly clear that this is a good way to deal with the situation. There are other options. Like you say, okay, the debt is a problem. There are other options to dealing with it. I mean, one of them is just to go, and they did this with some of the debt after 2008. You just sort of go, well, that was an emergency, that's why it's there. They introduce a new measure for the public debt that kind of excludes some of the debt. from the banking system. So you do something like that now. You just go, well, it was an emergency. It's over. Now, the problem then is that they're not going to blow a whistle and everyone goes back to work and it's as if nothing happens. I mean, this is the official forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility. So this will happen. This is not going to happen at all. So the things are going to drag on, and that's going to intensify the political debates about it. But we've already seen the Bank of England basically move to a sort of monetary financing position. They're printing money and giving it to the government effectively. They've opened an overdraft facility as well announced to, called the Ways and Means Facility. We've seen debt go through the roof, all your fiscal rules turn up, all that sort of thing. So we're already in quite a strange place. And I don't think at this point in time it's going to be quite as clear that the argument for austerity will win out in quite the same way. I think the arguments around security, what the state can do, and seeing the state as a sort of competitive influence are going to be much more important coming out of this.
Okay. Well, James, I think we're going to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
No worries.
We'll have you on again soon. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. And yourselves.
No. I love James.
Legend.
Yeah, somebody said in the comments 3 baldies. I just want to say Michael and I, and James as well, we all have full heads of hair. This is the quarantine look.
It's a choice. Yeah.
Actually, I haven't said it to Michael. This is actually my homage to him. This is my kind of, I'm a big Michael Walker fan. I think you've had a really good couple of months.
I wasn't the first guy to shave my head, to be honest. I mean, I can't really claim that as.
Okay. Okay.
You know
Well,
I mean?
okay. All right.
I can't patent that look.
Well, you were the first in Navarra, so we've got just short of 1,400 people watching, but only 600 likes. Smash the like button. Of course, we want you to do a bunch of other things, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But smash the like button. Doesn't cost you anything. Do it right now. Still got 1,400. Smash the like button. Come on. Let's go to more than 1,000 before the end of the show. It makes my day. And I don't even want to use the kinds of adjectives that would apply to Michael. How ecstatic. You smashing the like button makes
Me and you have different priorities now, though, Aaron.
What priorities?
You're obsessed with smashing the like button. I'm losing sleep because I don't think we have enough YouTube subscribers. So if you're watching this and you're not yet a subscriber, press the subscribe button. And if you're thinking, I don't have a Google account, get one and subscribe. It's worth it. It'll make me sleep better tonight.
I mean, that's kind of worrying. If Michael doesn't say, I want you to sleep better, Michael. So if that helps, fantastic. Well, that's good. You're doing it. The people are smashing the like button, smash subscribe too. Next story. This is a huge story. Deaths in England and Wales, 75% higher than usual in early April. We can just get this story up. There's the FT story, but you don't want that, do you, Fox? Actually, let's get up graphic 7A. This is from the FT, and they've got some of the copy in there mentioned. The number of death registrations in England and Wales was 75% higher than normal in the week ending April 10th. The Office for National Statistics said on Tuesday, today, as the coronavirus crisis led to the highest weekly figure for 20 years. The statistical agency said that 18,516 deaths were registered in that week, not month, week, compared with the average of 10,520 over the past 5 years. So you've got a big sample there of 5 years. The figures show the huge increase in mortality linked to the coronavirus outbreak. Now, those, of course, aren't all to do with coronavirus. Many will be directly, but also indirectly. But what we're seeing is actually a significant increase. So let's go to graphic 7C, which makes it even more concerning. They're also likely to be an underestimate of the national total because they do not include Scotland and Northern Ireland, where similar figures have been published over recent days. That's the official statistics, which may not be accurate. The ONS has also warned that the published number might be an underestimate because registrations normally fall over the Easter weekend. And then there's an issue with regards to deaths recorded in care homes. Obviously, so far, deaths have been almost all recorded in hospitals. This is graphic 8. The crisis in care homes was also bearing the figures with the number of weekly death registrations doubling from 2,471 in the second week in March to 4,927 in the second week in April. With many of these deaths not recorded as involving COVID-19, the ONS said it was working with the Care Quality Commission and Public Health England to better understand the deaths that are occurring in care homes. But clearly, if it's doubled, there's clearly something significant going on with care homes in regards to COVID-19. Michael, the official numbers, I believe, are about 17,500 deaths. Maybe after today, about 18,000 deaths. Do we have any idea about what the real numbers might be in regard to mortalities as a result of coronavirus?
No. So, I mean, it's quite unclear. There's a few different issues. So one is that what we get from the government, our daily updates are about people who've died in hospital. Then also, so they don't take into account people who've died outside of hospital. That does get updated, but it takes 11 days. So we will find out how many people have had COVID-19 written on their death certificate after 11 days. There's no cover up there. The controversy is about whether or not everyone who died from COVID-19 had it written on their death certificate. And that's partly because, it seems like initially doctors were a bit wary about putting COVID-19 on a death certificate if they weren't, if there hadn't been a COVID-19 test. So many people were just writing pneumonia. The more recent ONS data looks like a higher proportion of excess deaths are now being registered as COVID-19 than they were before. So it seems like doctors are being a bit more confident in putting down COVID-19, even if there hasn't been a test. And obviously we know that there aren't many tests to go around, so there wouldn't have been a test. I want to just bring up a clip though as well, because one of the things that worries me here is that there is uncertainty, and that's not a big problem so long as the government is very open and honest about that. If they say, look, the reason we tell you hospital deaths is because it's very quick and easy for us to count it. Then we will give you ONS deaths, which is also not a complete picture, because that just depends on whether COVID-19 is put in the death certificate, and some people will miss that out. We actually have to look at excess deaths. Now, that would be a very reasonable thing for the government to say. I want to go to what Yvonne Doyle, who was medical director, or is medical director of Public Health England, this is what she said yesterday when asked about the different death statistics.
The hospital data do not tell the whole story of total deaths. And this week, as for last week, we will have a comprehensive view of that later in the week from ONS. I don't know whether 40% is a correct figure. I couldn't really say that, but I would expect more. And we know now from looking at the pattern that 9 out of 10 deaths do occur in hospital. And
so, I mean, that makes me kind of uncomfortable, because it's, again, where we've got someone who is a medic, a scientist, standing in, as a government spokesperson and there as an expert, who is speaking with a degree of certainty which she shouldn't have. We really don't know. We 100%. I can say with certainty that we know that we don't know that 9 out of 10 people who've died from COVID-19 have died in hospital. So the most recent ONS data, which came out today, so the day after she was speaking, has found that of people whose death certificates say COVID-19, 84% died in hospital. So that means 16% died outside of hospital. So even that is above her figure. And yes, that was released the day after she said that, but she spoke with certainty there. She didn't say, we think at the moment this many people do. But then even that ONS figure, which says that 16% of people die outside of hospital, is probably a massive underestimate, because that's only a proportion of the excess deaths that happened during that period of time. So there is a high degree of uncertainty. There was a big headline sort of saying that the ONS shows that 40% more people have died than was originally included in the government statistics. That's partly about timing. So that's partly just about the lag in terms of when it is reported. But it's this question of who dies in the community and excess deaths that ultimately we will be looking at when sort of comparing countries.
Yeah, if we could just go to, I think maybe we should probably just go to the next story, because I think that's one that's just going to have to be returned to, I guess, in subsequent shows, this numbers thing, because there's so much speculation as to, like you say, I think it's clear that she's not being entirely honest about the data there, but we don't know, the extent to which she's not being honest. Although it should be said, when the final quote I read out, and it's, we'll be working alongside Public Health England to ensure, better data around this. Public Health England in February and March was saying that Britain was adequately prepared for, the coronavirus. They said we don't need more PPE. We said it was a low risk to the public. So as a public health agency, it's hardly covered itself in glory in recent months. And there
is also clearly disputes about this, within the people who are responsible for publishing this information. So you will have noted, if you were watching the press conferences up to sort of this weekend, in fact, they had a line for number of deaths in France, which included people who died in care and people who died outside of hospital, which was being compared to a line from Britain, which was only hospital deaths, which made it look like the crisis was much more severe in France and we were performing relatively better. It was only after that was called out by people on Twitter and then ultimately people in the press conference that the government were forced to put a new line on their graph, which was people who died in hospital and in the community. So it's perfectly reasonable for there to be uncertainty here, but sometimes it can feel like the government come clean when they've been put under pressure to do so. So, I think this will remain a politically contentious issue, and so it should, really.
Next story. The final story before we go to questions. Get them on the hashtag #TistGeeSour and get them in the comments with a rocket emoji. This is the final story we're going to cover. Tory split, with many wanting to end lockdown. The Mail is reporting that the UK faces tough coronavirus curbs until 2021, amid claims Boris Johnson's personal battle with the disease has made him tentative about lifting the lockdown. If we can bring up, actually, let's just bring up graphic 11, please, Fox. That'd be really helpful. Basically, what we're seeing is a profound split in the Tory party about when and how to lift the lockdown. You've got Rishi Sunak wanting to lift it sooner than others. You've got Matt Hancock wanting it to stay in place. And of course, yesterday was the sort of beginning of the furlough program. As I talked about with James briefly, taxpayers will pay the wages of 1 million people at a cost of more than 1 billion after 144,000 companies hit by coronavirus applied for government support in a single day. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, said that employers would receive grants within 6 days to pay staff who had been furloughed as the government opened its coronavirus job retention scheme. Experts believe the unprecedented intervention will eventually cost the government more than £40 billion, and that 8.3 million people could apply. So as I said earlier on with James, basically in one day yesterday, the number of people on the government payroll increased by 20%. As a result of this furlough scheme, by the end of it, many more people will be on the furlough scheme than probably are on government payrolls. We'll see how many adopt it, but that's how it's looking right now. They said 40 billion, but then Rishi Sunak said last week it was going to be extended by a month. So now we're probably looking at about 50 billion. Then you look at weird stuff like the global downturn in regards to oil prices. Do you think, Michael, that the Tories are looking at, then you look at the data around a global, a UK downturn of 35% economic contraction. Do you think the Tories look at the deficit they're going to run? They look at the state of the economy the other side of this. They look at global variables and they think, actually, you know what? Okay, 100,000 people might die, 200,000 people might die, but and hey, the health system might collapse, but we'll take that over the alternative of a 20% deficit. Debt to GDP going to 140, 150%. China taking great swathes of the global market. Do you think there's a calculation going on there right now inside the Conservative cabinet? Because that's how it seems.
Well, I doubt there's anyone in the Conservative cabinet who is willing to allow for a situation where the NHS collapses. I think the big turning point for the government when they decided to move from their sort of herd immunity, let's let it run through the population and kill 100,000 people, which seemed like that was their original estimate, was one, there was a bit of pushback from the public, but also they realized that actually, older people and vulnerable people dying earlier is one thing. Seeing our ICU capacities overflowing, seeing hospitals in absolute crisis, and our health system on the brink of collapse. I think they decided actually that would not be politically.
But isn't that
so visceral?
Isn't that a short-term thing though? I mean, so you could basically say, okay, we're going to have 200,000 people die, but you can massively increase ICU capacity by the ventilators, by the testing. I'm not suggesting they're going to give up on that. I'm not suggesting they're going to just adopt herd immunity wholesale. What they could be thinking is, okay, because this furlough scheme goes through to June, which is several months. We build multiple more NHS Nightingales. We get all the testing kits. We do a bit of track and trace, or quite a bit of track and trace. But ultimately, given the scale of the potential economic hit, actually, we're going to prioritize the economy over minimizing human casualties. Do you not think that calculation is being made?
That's being made. Yeah, that's being made. I just wanted to. I don't think any of them would want to let it run right to the degree that the NHS is overwhelmed and collapses. That's all I'm saying. So I think the debate is between the people who want to flatten the curve and the people who want to, which has always been the government's official policy, but they've never been quite clear about what they mean by that. And people who want to stop transmission altogether so that we can introduce some sort of test and trace system. And the differences between these two are, the big policy debate which is going on throughout the world at the moment, which is whether you want, and the technical way of talking about it is whether you want R, which is the reproduction rate of COVID-19, to be very close to zero, or whether you're happy so long as it's below 1. And for the transmission rate of it to be below 1, you need social distancing measures, until there's a vaccine. but you don't need to completely, destroy the disease. So a lockdown that we've got now is probably having the transmission rate, a fair bit below 1, but not really close to 0. And so what Rishi Sunak and people will be arguing is that we can open up much bigger sections of the economy than we currently are, so long as, to keep the transmission rate below 1, which means that we'll see basically a steady amount of infections and a steady amount of deaths. So we could be seeing, 200 deaths a day for a year even. That's quite possible on the sort of let's keep the transmission rate steady. The other argument, and this is what's, like the hammer and the dance strategy, is you say we have a really serious lockdown to try and get transmission almost at 0. So barely any transmission in the community whatsoever. And after that, we introduce a very sort of aggressive test and trace system, which means that wherever COVID-19 pops up, we try and, surround it and contain it. And I think that's the debate going on in government, whereby, and the argument for the second one is that you could actually have more economic growth in that one because you don't need much of a lockdown at all if you've got an aggressive test and trace system. But the argument that Rishi Sunak and people, I presume, will be putting forward is to say, yes, that's lovely in theory, but for us as a state to be able to develop a system of test and trace which is effective will take us a few more months, and we can't handle a few more months trying to keep the transmission rate close to 0. I also think, James's point was incredibly prescient, which is I think this probably isn't about what's going to be the ultimate bill, but it is about international competitiveness. So what you hear from the people who want to basically just end the lockdown and go for herd immunity and sort of fuck the dead is to say, look, if we continue this lockdown, that's going to necessitate there's going to be no choice but to have austerity afterwards, which is going to mean lots of poor, miserable people. And obviously that is something you have to push back against because austerity is always going to be a political choice. And I think, James's point that this is actually about who gets to come out of lockdown first, because then they get a competitive edge against other countries or their competitors. That's the real beef that they're having in cabinet at the moment.
But of course, that's wrong because you come out too quickly and you don't deal with it effectively, and you have a second wave where it could potentially be far worse than the first. So I suppose there's a calculation there. From what it sounds like to me, they're not really erring on the side of caution, though. Like you see with China, you had the lockdown. You then had this traffic light system, which is being touted here as well. And basically everybody on their phone, hundreds of millions of people within the Alipay mobile payment system was given a QR code based upon their age, who they've been in contact with, where they were situated and so on, and whether they could use trains, buses, go to work and so on. If you had red, you couldn't really move. If you're orange, you're sort of similar-ish, but you can do, necessary things. And if you're green, you can kind of go where you like. But it sounds to me, there's a few things here. So firstly, I think Britain doesn't have the technological infrastructure to do a lot of this stuff as quickly as the Chinese. That's the first thing. I was saying about a month ago, we probably need a universal online payment system to sort of back end a lot of this stuff. Because, we haven't got the time to do that. And we could have started to build that with the furlough scheme, for instance, and had the kind of the big data sets that you're going to need to deal with tens of millions of people and so on. But anyway, so we haven't got the capacity to do that. But secondly, it just seems like there's not the political leadership to be that to take a decision of that scale and against public sentiment, which, as you've highlighted so many times, this is like the most. I don't like the word popular because nobody actively wants it, but people are actively consenting to it more than anybody could have ever expected in terms of it prohibiting their sort of their lives. What do you think, quickly, before we go to questions, what do you think the Labour Party should do? This is a very popular policy. People really like it. It's clearly going to minimise loss of life. But at the same time, there is going to be a major economic downturn. Many people are going to lose their jobs. Many businesses will go out of business, frankly. If this stayed in place till, say, September, October, there's lots of businesses that go to the wall, not just big ones, small ones do. So what do you think Labour should do? The emphasis has been on the exit plan. I've disagreed with that. I think it's a bit vacuous, personally. Other than the health stuff, which obviously there's loads of easy wins, track and trace, PPE, ventilators, what else do you think Labour could be sort of going big on?
Well, I think the Labour Party should be going big on test and trace, right? And saying an aggressive enough test and trace policy that we are able to essentially suppress this disease until a vaccine comes about. And And so to not go for slow herd immunity. The other thing is to push the government on precisely what their plan is. And this is where I think Labour have been kind of weak, because they're basically just saying, can you tell us what your exit strategy is, instead of pointedly asking, is this your exit strategy? And so one exit strategy, which isn't insane, and it's sort of what Sweden are doing, is you say, look, if we have moderate social distancing measures, which are currently in place in Sweden, we can keep the transmission rate at around 1, which means that it will move through the population steadily, but not in an exponential way, which means that we can remain within the capacity of our health service. But quite a lot of people will die. So a lot of people will die, but the system won't collapse. That might well be the Conservatives' policy, and if it is, they should be forced to lay it out. The other option is that their policy is to say we're going to suppress this virus and have aggressive test and trace. If I was the Labour Party, I'd be saying, look, the aggressive test and trace one is the right policy, and we should therefore remain in lockdown until we have the capacity to do an aggressive test and trace system, which means that we don't have thousands more people or hundreds dying a day until a vaccine is found.
We're going to get questions very shortly. I just want to say, I was talking about this before we started the show. Do you know how long it took to develop the most rapidly developed vaccine in human history, Michael?
4 years, because I heard you say it. Yeah.
4 years for months. And yet everybody's saying, 18 months, as if it's already happened, which is quite a concern. And then another really interesting story is the fact that, okay, it's one thing to create the vaccine, but given obviously the global demand for it, 8 billion, 7 billion people, we don't want 7 billion doses. Britain doesn't actually have domestic manufacturing capacity to generate 40, 50, 60 million doses of vaccine. Even the US, which has domestic pharmaceutical companies that could do it, is going to really struggle. And people might say, well, you've got GlaxoSmithKline. Apparently, GlaxoSmithKline doesn't manufacture its vaccines in the UK. So, it's quite a major thing that, again, it's kind of like Labour identifying, okay, well, if you want to talk about an exit strategy, okay, well, even if there is a vaccine developed in 2 years, there's absolutely no way of diffusing it quickly enough to the population at large. How are we going to do that? Nobody's talking about it.
And that's precisely why the Conservatives, favoured policy, and many people still think it is their policy, is herd immunity, which is to say, let's let it move through the population, but much slower than they were letting it move through the population before. And I suppose the argument that you could make, as Rishi Sunak as well for that, is to say that unless we go for a herd immunity strategy, everything we do is going to fundamentally undermine our worldview. So the longer we stay in lockdown, the more people are receiving and relying on government support. I think one of the reasons the lockdown is popular is because everyone wanted to live through the Blitz. When people always talk about this Blitz spirit, everyone wanted to live in a society with some purpose, where they got to sort of think I'm in the same struggle as my neighbours. And that's kind of happening, and it's dependent on a lot of state support, which is a threat to the kind of economic policy that Rishi Sunak might want to implement. And the same thing with the test and trace system. It requires a level of government intervention, which a country like China and a country like South Korea and even Germany are comfortable doing. But I think there are people at the top of the Conservative Party who think that it's not worth saving 100,000 lives if it means undermining our whole economic worldview.
Yeah, we just got a super chat from Connor Cusack. Thank you very much, Connor, for £10. Much appreciated. We've got just under 1,500 people watching. Just under 1,000 people have smashed the like button. Smash the like button. There's a big discrepancy there. We're taking questions, and please put more of them on the hashtag DiskySour, and in the comments. This is from Jeff Shambrook. I watched the show on YouTube on my TV. The thumbs up like button has disappeared, so I have to link up my iPad to hit like and send messages. Thanks as always. I wish I could support with pounds. No problem, Jeff. Thank you for watching. Dan tweets on hashtag DiskySour. Can you see any anti-lockdown protests happening in the UK, such as those happening in the US? That's for you, Michael.
No.
Great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say no. The ones that are happening in the US are very small. So it's there's some great pictures on Twitter. I wish we could get one up now, actually. So you'll be able to find them quite easily. So sometimes when you look at those protests on the ground, they look quite dramatic because they've got a shot full of sort of like 100 people with signs saying ridiculous things such as
semi-automatic rifles,
social distancing equals communism. Yeah. But when you've got a far shot, you realize actually that's a tiny fucking demo. And also they've got the president egging them on. So even with the president of the United States egging on protests against social distancing, they're not really taking off. Even Donald Trump's base is pro-lockdown, and he's really trying to agitate against it. So I think the idea that we would have the same thing here, where the only people advocating for, the kind of extreme end to a lockdown that these people in the States are going for is like Toby Young and Daniel Hannan. Like, I really don't think they can amass a particularly large crowd in this country.
Next question from Jason Bournemouth, who tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour. Isn't the blunt truth that if the MSM order folk to get back to work and back austerity, they will? Michael?
It's an interesting question. I mean, that's going to be a political question about organisation, isn't it? I mean, I think it's if no one is arguing against austerity, there's going to be a big pressure from people like George Osborne, but also probably people at the top of the Conservative Party and people in the mainstream media to say the debt of this crisis has to be paid. We all came together. The government stepped up. You stepped up, but now we are going to have a decade of austerity. I mean, that is going to be a real powerful dominant narrative, and unless there are people to fight against it, that will happen. But
unlike 2010, I mean, this is what I want to get to our audience tonight, I guess, is that, unlike 2010, that would lead to a global, if it was adopted everywhere, global depression. It wouldn't be, but it would lead to a depression here, because you can't have highly indebted individuals, households, businesses, the state, and then the state is trying to deleverage, because basically all it will do is just further push down aggregate economic activity. And this isn't a particularly radical thing to say. We can look at what Britain did after 2010 and the effects it had. It's plainly obvious. So I mean, that is a big worry, and I agree with you. It could be that the entire political and media class get behind it. Could be. But then you're looking at 0% GDP growth, long-term unemployment, etc. And I just think that in itself will create a political kickback for them.
Well, I mean, what you could see, and what's quite plausible as sort of like a right-wing response to this that doesn't lead to depression, is you say you use the need for austerity as a justification to, take away people's social protections. So, for example, the minimum wage. But then you pump money into other parts of the economy. So you pump money into the parts of the economy which don't empower labor, giving loads of money to startups, giving loads of money to giving tax breaks to big corporations, maybe, funding a lot of infrastructure via the state, but all the while slashing people's basic social protections, because that's an option that won't necessarily lead to deflation if it is counterbalanced by other interventionist measures, which the government or the ruling class think are more attuned to their interests.
This is from Russell Johnson, asks, is the discussion to end lockdown a measure of stupidity or insanity, or just the government couldn't care less?
Well, I mean, it depends also. It depends what one means by ending the lockdown. I mean, if to end the lockdown and go back to life as normal right now would be insanity from any perspective. Because if what you're interested in is like profits and the legitimacy of free market capitalism, ending the lockdown outright and having another peak on the scale of our first one would be madness. The debate to me seems to be more about, do we move from the lockdown to a more moderate, mode of social distancing, which is going to let the virus run slowly through the population, kill quite a lot of people, but without, beds bursting out of ICU departments? Or do we try and keep the lockdown going for long enough and potentially make it stricter so that we get the transmission rate down to about 0 and then can do test and trace to get rid of it altogether? So, I mean, maybe I'll reject the premise of the question. So, I mean, I think anyone like these people on the American streets, and Donald Trump actually, who want to just go back to normal, they're just idiots who don't care about anyone else. The debate happening in government at the moment is slightly more nuanced.
I think we're going to leave it there. We've sort of finished it on the dot at 1 minute past 9. Do you have anything to add, Michael? Tell us a little bit about your guest tomorrow evening. I mean, that sounds like quite a treat.
Yeah, so tomorrow we have on Bill Hanage, who is a Harvard epidemiologist, and we are going to be going through, the various strategies. He's British, but also obviously working in America. So we're going to do a bit of, comparing the response to COVID-19 in those two countries. Bill was someone who, when the government was still adopting a herd immunity strategy, he was one of the loudest critics of it. So he's actually on, I think that weekend, he sort of had a minute-long segment on BBC News saying this policy is insane. So, we can ask some questions about what does it feel like to have seen the disaster, unfolding as it happened. But the main thing I want to focus on is exit strategies and the various plausible ways there are that to get out of this, and what the epidemiological community are talking about when they discuss leaving the lockdowns. So that'll be tomorrow at 8 p.m.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it. If we don't have a vaccine for 3 years, it doesn't roll out for another couple of years. I mean, this could be like 5-6 years. I mean, maybe longer.
Yeah, so much of all discussion on this is premised on the fact that, of course, we'll have a vaccine within 18 months.
Yeah, or you will be personally vaccinated within 18 months. Everybody is like that. That's clearly not going to happen. You've been watching. Go on. Yeah. No, go on.
I'm saying it could happen. I wouldn't want to now, say that's definitely not going to happen.
How can it happen? How can it happen? How can you? One person may, a small group of people beyond clinical trials. Obviously, that could happen next week. But the idea that how we haven't even got the facilities in this country to generate it, even if the IP was publicly available, etc. How?
Well, there's never been
18 months.
So your argument for why your principal argument for why it couldn't be done in 18 months is that the quickest it's been done before is 4 years, right?
That's not my principal argument. It's one of my arguments. Yeah.
So
my other argument is, how do you make 50 million doses when we haven't got the capacity to generate vaccinations?
Well, my argument would be that if the state, if all of the richest states in the world put their full state capacity towards developing a vaccine in 18 months, then we haven't seen that kind of mobilization before, and quite a lot becomes possible that might have seemed impossible before.
All right. Fox is telling us to hurry up. Before you do go, if you like tonight's show, if you like what we're doing, if you're listening on iTunes, I think it's a great podcast. We really appreciate it if you could consider making a one-off payment or a rolling subscription of what we think of as maybe an hours of wage work. I put that in a very bad, you always say it much better than I do, Michael. 1 hour's waged work. So if you're earning £15 an hour, £15 a month, to help us produce more podcasts, more articles, more videos. We have a daily podcast with the Burner. We have obviously this evening show. We have articles going out all the time, more exclusives coming your way. To help us do more of that, to build that new media for different politics, go to novaramedia.com/support. You've been great. Michael will be back tomorrow night with that outstanding guest. And I'll see you again on Thursday. Good night.